There are many different kinds of resistance organizations, but broadly speaking, we can divide them into above ground and underground groups. So above ground groups are those that usually don't carry out, many risky kind of illegal activities, and they exist to maximize communications, the use of social networks to mobilize large numbers of people, and to generally organize in an open way. Underground groups, on the other hand, are groups that carry out activities that are illegal or repressed, or for which there could be, significant costs or reprisals. And so they organize themselves very differently in order to maximize their own security and their own effectiveness. Now, I think there's kind of a popular picture of underground groups or underground action as being, that of armed guerrillas or fugitives or this sort of thing, but that's not necessarily the case. There are many reasons that groups do and have organized in the underground. One of those would be to provide asylum or escape for persecuted people. That's something that's happened many times in history in the Underground Railroad, escape lines in occupied Europe. The sanctuary movement in North America and many places for political refugees and for battered women. All of these are underground kind of movements that help to protect people. There are also underground organizations for those people themselves, for people who face political or religious or social persecution, including gay and lesbian groups. They've historically organized in kind of secretive or underground fashions to protect themselves. Another reason is to gather intelligence. So in many resistance movements, there have been kind of specific groups that have tried to gather information. And we can see some of the same principles at work in, say, the Citizens Committee to investigate the FBI that in the 1970s, broke into an FBI office and shared all of the files on COINTELPRO. Before then, people didn't realize that this sort of thing was going on. Even WikiLeaks and these kind of programs or these kind of organizations use a lot of the same principles. Another reason would be to share information or to propagandize. Underground newspapers and underground communication have been an essential part of resisting oppressive or authoritarian governments for a long time. And you saw the same thing in Soviet Russia. Samizdat, there were underground networks where people would copy out entire pamphlets and entire books by hand, because they couldn't, the typewriters were all controlled. So they would use these networks to pass literature to each other and information. And then, of course, there are groups that organize for general kind of liberation organizing, often nonviolent liberation organizing. And that may happen because the government is particularly interested in surveillance or repression, as in many Eastern European or Latin American examples, or it may happen because a group has been declared illegal, which was the case of the African National Congress, for example, in 1960 and onward. So I hope that makes it clear that these underground groups have a long and honorable and important history in many different struggles for justice and equality. But those different groups, above ground and underground groups, are organized in very divergent ways and often mutually exclusive ways. There are different rules that are required to make each kind of group or each kind of organization as effective and as safe as possible. And I think that often the conflicts that we have when people are talking about more serious action or talking about illegal action is that it's not always clear exactly where the boundaries are and what appropriate rules are. And I think that can generate a lot of paranoia and a lot of, kind of destructive group dynamics or fear. So I want to start off by going over a few of the kind of general fundamental differences between above ground and underground groups, and then go over some actual kind of networks and diagrams of how those groups organize and how that's different. So to start with, and this is in your booklet, the issue of membership. So above ground groups, they are effective largely through intelligent strategy and tactics, of course, like all resistance groups, but especially by mobilizing larger numbers of people and by mobilizing people from many different groups or constituencies. So in above ground groups, the membership is usually open. that you know who the membership is. People in the group know each other and grow to trust each other. In underground groups, on the other hand, membership is closed and it's closely guarded. And so members may know the people that they're working most closely with, but they probably don't know many people in the other organizations. And this is actually an important principle called compartmentalization, that underground movements really limit the number of people that any given person might know for safety, and we'll come back to that idea. Another important difference is in their kind of public face and their outward behavior. Above ground groups, they usually want to attract attention, to gain as much information as possible, and so or not as much information, pardon me, as much publicity and kind of awareness. And members of a group are probably going to voice their opinion openly and loudly, to say, you know, this is why we care about this injustice, and this is what has to be done about it. Now, in contrast, of course, underground groups, pardon me, are a lot more secretive. And so members of those groups are not going to be very open about their political beliefs. They may appear, you know, normal or even conservative, because that's a way of protecting their membership in that group. In terms of decision making, and this is really important, I think, above ground groups are often kind of democratic, transparent, and participatory, and you know, they really kind of use the best kind of most adored leftist methods of decision making, like consensus, or things that can work well above ground. And the reason for that is because when you're above ground, it doesn't matter if you have kind of long conversations with people that take a long time to come to consensus. It doesn't matter if you share as much information as possible, because, you know, that's how kind of democratic decision making works effectively, that everyone involved needs to have as much decision as possible, or as much information as possible, to make a good decision. And that's very different for underground groups because of the kind of need to know principles and because of this compartmentalization. So underground groups tend to use a different kind of decision-making structure. If they're small face-to-face peer groups, then they can still use, you know, participatory methods, such as in one individual cell. But in a larger system or in larger networks, there's often kind of a hierarchy or a rank structure. And if they're facing really dangerous, you know, life and death situations, then it's usually set up so that there's one person who, if they're not in charge all the time, can have kind of take charge. Because, you know, if you're about to be, you know, arrested by the police, or if you're being, you know, chased down, there's not time to sit down for a long consensus meeting about how to best proceed. And another important part, and this is just kind of a corollary of the second, is the internal communication of that group and internal movement. In above ground groups, there's plenty of internal communication. People talk to each other all the time, you know, build social bonds, strong ties, and people might move from one group to another quite frequently in order to, you know, communicate or trade skills or that sort of thing. And that's very different from underground groups, which tend to be very selective about how much communication they have with other people or between groups. They tend to use, you know, hidden communication or codes, cryptography, and they tend not to move people between groups very much because of that compartmentalization idea. Because, you know, if you move from one group to another, then all of a sudden you know more people, and at that point it becomes increasingly dangerous, because if someone is captured, they can, you know, expose a larger part of that network. Now, actions. Above ground groups, they want to get attention, right? So if they're going to do an action, say a march or in a financial district, then they're going to announce that ahead of time, probably, because they want to get as many people there. They want media coverage. And so what they often do is they'll go to areas where their enemy is the strongest or most concentrated. So, you know, a financial district, a government house for a protest. And that's really the opposite of what underground groups want to do.